All right, so hello everybody and welcome to Beyond the Abstract. This is season 2, episode 3, and for the first time we have 2 guests, which is very unusual. So the first is Pia Resnik and the second is Elouise Botes. Pia, Elouise, welcome. Could you start by introducing yourselves a little bit? I'll have got your bio on the page accompanying the episode, but if you could just go through it yourselves, that would be great. Maybe Pia first.
Yeah. So thank you, Thomas, for inviting us today. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, what should I say about myself? Like, start literally at the beginning in academia. But I started studying English at the University of Graz. And yeah, and during that time, I was actually quite fortunate to spend a research visit at the University of Newcastle, visiting Vivian Cook, who I'd say, yeah, he shaped my way of thinking about second language acquisition with his ideas of linguistic multi-competence. And this is really the time when I got interested in emotions, which was not the topic I researched back then, but my participants brought it up all the time. So I decided to then continue with my PhD in this area, which I also did in Graz. And during my PhD, I then was lucky to spend a research visit at Birkbeck with Jean-Marc de Waally. And I focused on emotions in the context of multilingualism back then. So how people verbalize and perceive emotions in the different languages. And yeah, and at this time, I also started working as a lecturer at the University of Graz, teaching English language competence courses, but also courses in applied linguistics. And then afterwards, because, you know, it's not that easy in academia, I'd say for young people, I started teaching basically at various different places in Austria, from Graz to Salzburg to Vienna, and I ended up as a senior lecturer at the University of Vienna, where, yeah, well, most of my students were trainee teachers, and this is when I became really interested in this group. And then eventually in 2018, I got the professorship for English language teaching and research methodology at the University College of Teacher Education in Vienna. And this is, you could say, when, yeah, my main focus shifted there. And when I, yeah, worked full time with student teachers. And I do train teachers for the, student teachers for the primary level at the University College of Teacher Education, who are trained generalists, and I specialize in English. And I do work with student teachers for the secondary level who specialize in English at the University of Vienna. Yeah. And in a nutshell, I'd say I love my job. I love working with them. I love teaching and learning from them, but I also like the research side to it. So yeah,
Great.
so that's sort of my background.
Thanks.
Okay, so I guess my turn. My name is Elouise. I am a South African citizen, and I studied psychology in South Africa at the University of Stellenbosch, where I did my bachelor, honours and master's degrees, and then I worked for a little while as an organizational psychologist in Eskom, which is a large energy company, well, the only energy company really in South Africa. And I was in industry for a while, but I wanted to return back to research, to be honest, back to academia. So I left to do a PhD in Luxembourg in psychology, but the PhD was part of an interdisciplinary group where we focused on language and diversity linked to language, because of course Luxembourg is an extremely multilingual country. So any type of language research question is really valid to ask in this country. And I came over, I did my PhD, I graduated in 2021. And basically my research since then has been in between psychology, I would say individual differences psychology, research methodology, and applied linguistics. So I bring a little bit more of the research methods, I would say, and the psychology background, and Pia brings a lot about linguistics and a lot more deeper knowledge in applied linguistics than I have. So that's why I think we also work well together in these types of projects. I did a Yeah, I graduated in 2021, then did a first postdoc at the University of Vienna in the education and psychology department there. And then I came back to Luxembourg a little over a year ago to do a second postdoc. And I'm currently affiliated with the Institute of Cognitive Science and Assessment here, as well as the Luxembourg Center for Educational Testing, which is responsible for educational monitoring in the country. And there, of course, languages forms a big part of it. So,
right.
Yeah, it's the mix of the two, I would say, of ed psych and applied linguistics that my work currently takes. Yeah. And the majority of what I do is research. I'm in a very privileged position to not have to teach that much. So I can focus a lot of time on research.
Oh, so we've got both halves going on here, it seems,
yeah.
Right? Fantastic. So the title of the paper that we're going to discuss today is A Tangled Web, Learner Autonomy as a Predictor of Learner Emotions, Willingness to Communicate, and Academic Achievement in Online Language Learning. It's a great title. I like the Tangled Web parts. What was it that drew you into the kind of learner autonomy focus of the paper? What's it? Is it about the learner autonomy? Yeah, Pia? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that, this has been researched widely that learner autonomy plays a big role and is a big factor when it comes to foreign language learning. But what we mostly know about is its role in on-site foreign language learning. And then it was actually at the beginning of the pandemic when I developed a project together with Jean-Marc Dewali, where we also looked at learner autonomy. So at the time when the classes were like put online for the very first time, which we back then referred to as emergency remote teaching. And we were interested in, its role linked to learner emotions. And what we found in this study, so the very first one, was that learner emotions seem to be dulled in the online mode, that they seem to function differently. So usually you would find this moderate correlation between, for instance, foreign language enjoyment and foreign language anxiety. And this one broke in the online mode. So this made us notice that there is this context sensitivity of learner emotions. And what we also found linked to learner autonomy back then was that it played a much bigger role in the online mode. And I'd say for me, this is how I got interested in exploring this link further. I don't know about you, Elouise, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested because the paper is actually part of a special issue for Peter McIntyre, who was part of my dissertation CET, so my panel at my defense. And I met Peter through my PhD work and through Jean-Marc Dewali, who was also a second supervisor on my PhD. So when the opportunity came up to write the paper, Pia and I talked about what data we have available, what have we not explored, and we obviously I thought we should focus on willingness to communicate because that's been Peter's very big contribution to the field, has been willingness to communicate. And Pia came with the idea of, okay, let's have a look perhaps at autonomy and willingness to communicate, because that's been underexplored, and it would be an interesting thing to see to what extent does autonomy influence this volition to speak the actual language as an outcome variable. And for me, as the one that usually does the statistics, a bunch of models started running through my head, and I was like, okay, how could we possibly test this? What do we have available? And then Pia obviously brought up, yes, but we have to include the emotions as well, because they do tend to function a bit differently in the online format. And that's basically how we came up with the hypothesis and the model that we tested.
So we heard a lot of kind of key terminology there. Maybe we could dig into a little bit. So we've got emotions is obviously a huge thing. Maybe you could talk a bit about the specific emotions that you were kind of interested in here, and willingness to communicate as well, and also just what you mean by autonomy, right? In a learning autonomy.
Okay.
Well, with emotions, we specifically focused on, in this paper, on foreign language enjoyment and foreign language anxiety. And Well, I'd say that I'm now talking for both of us, and I hope otherwise, please correct me, Elouise. But I'd say, why did we take this holistic approach to exploring the role? Because, in the past, it was mostly about the negative side of things. So there was a strong focus research-wise on the role that foreign language classroom anxiety plays. And then it was Jean-Marc Wale and Peter McIntyre with the seminal work in the field on foreign language enjoyment, who actually made us aware of the two emotions basically not being opposite poles on the same dimension and that they function differently. Well, research showed, for instance, that enjoyment is a more fleeting experience than anxiety, and is basically that, for instance, as a foreign language teacher, you have more influence or you can basically influence enjoyment more than anxiety, which is a more stubborn variable. And then partly also, of course, we saw in previous research that the two tend to function differently in the online mode, as Elouise already said. So it made much sense to include both. And previous research also by Elouise, I think your meta studies were really important in that respect to show their crucial role when it comes to achievements. And in a nutshell, they are the driving force, I'd say, underlying foreign language learning, with anxiety having a hindering function and enjoyment broadening function, as it was Tammy Gregerson and Peter McIntyre who actually wrote about this a lot. And I don't know, do you want to continue, Elouise, or I can also?
The emotions, I think you explained very well and very true. So the main thing has just always been that enjoyment seems to be quite linked to the classroom and the classroom environment, where anxiety seems to be very internal and, as Pia said, quite stubborn. So it's very hard to actually design interventions to change levels of anxiety, because it's so tied to also things like your personality and your own predisposition to feel anxiety. So that's also why they're always interesting to examine and shouldn't be considered the opposites of a coin, for example, like two sides of one coin, is rather two very separate variables that are at times related, but at times not. Then, of course, they are both, in previous research, have both been found to be linked to willingness to communicate. There's the meta-analysis that Peter McIntyre was also involved in, linking anxiety to willingness to communicate, I think moderately strongly. And then our own preliminary meta-analysis on enjoyment also linked it to willingness to communicate. And I should probably define willingness to communicate as well. So it is basically when you learn a language and you start to develop a vocabulary, you start to develop this ability to put a sentence together, and you're placed in the position to be able to speak. So, for example, yesterday I had to go to our Bürgeramt to talk to someone there about some administration, and the lady greeted me in Luxembourgish. I have a basic level of Luxembourgish, and I can string together the sentence in Luxembourgish in my head. But that moment of deciding, will I respond in Luxembourgish or will I respond in English? That is willingness to communicate. And I'm ashamed to say I responded in English because I don't know, administration overwhelms me. But in that moment, I did not have the willingness to communicate, even though the sentence was in my head and I knew how to say it. It's that specific volitional process, the moment where you go from I can do it in my head to actually doing it, is willingness to communicate. And it's seen as a quite important outcome in the process of language learning, because in the process of language learning, it is not enough to be able to theoretically produce the language. You have to also be willing to actually produce it. And I mean, the concept is, or the concept is quite complex at the moment, where I think Peter and expanded it now to a pyramid model recently. So it's a sort of 3D complex model that integrates a lot of things in terms of the environment, individual, etc. I won't go into that though. If people are interested, happily, please go read McIntyre and Henry 2023. That introduces the pyramid model. But yeah, and of course then willingness to communicate has sort of become a central outcome variable in the field of individual differences in language learning, alongside things like perceived proficiency, actual proficiency, academic achievement, etc.
Okay. And so in that context, where does that fit into autonomy, learner autonomy?
Okay, that's a good question. Pia, I don't know if you want to explain the way we looked at autonomy, because my explanation of it is very rooted in the methods, but...
Well, basically it's about, if you think about the online mode, then like I said before, autonomy plays, and that's, I think, very obvious, this taking charge of one's own learning and being able to do so takes on a much bigger role. And as we also saw in our previous study, it was that, students tended to react differently to being given this increased autonomy, right? So they either very much appreciated this freedom to choose when to learn what, for instance, but of course, at the same time, it's also kind of tricky because it might potentially increase your feelings of isolation, you could say. This is what makes it particularly interesting to study in the online mode. And when it comes to how we basically conceptualized it in the paper, and that's now also linked to the stats and the scale we used, but we used the scale by McCaskill and Taylor that was originally developed for the tertiary level. And I think now I need to think carefully about that and hard about that, but they conceptualized it basically as consisting of items that captured the learner's study habits on the one hand, and then it was also about the learning experiences, like I'm good at picking out topics, basically, on my own and things like that.
Right, so the kind of technical abilities for learning independently, as well as the psychological aspects of that as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then also, I mean, because you mentioned its potential links to willingness to communicate, if you tend to, I think it's very much also what makes it so interesting is also this potentially increased sense of feeling isolated. So making this language learning experience less of a social adventure in the online mode, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that kind of made us then, ask ourselves to what extent do these variables, so this tangled web of interrelated elements, to what extent does this web potentially behave differently in the online mode from what we know from on-site foreign language learning?
Right. Elouise, was there anything you wanted to add on that?
So what I would also add is, so when we talk about the tangled web, so the term we usually use in our papers is a nomological network. And it's a term we use in individual differences psychology as well, where the nomological network is basically a network of variables that all seem to co-function together. So when it comes to language learning, we know that we have the outcome of language learning. We want you to be able to learn, and we want you to be able to produce speech in this. But then we need to identify what possible individual differences variables may co-vary or relate to this outcome variable in this network, or tangled web, for example. And we have identified things like personality. We've identified very many emotion variables that are continuously expanding. It's a very productive field at the moment. And then, of course, we have things like autonomy. And as Pia said, we measured autonomy in a very specific way, where we looked at things like your own feelings of autonomy towards your study habits, do I actually take the initiative? Do I do it by myself? This is different from how we would say autonomy is in terms of your own autonomy needs that might be rooted in your personality, for example, your autonomy needs outside of your studying English and in other areas of your life. So when you interpret this paper as well, it has to be interpreted through the very narrow lens by which we measured the nomological network. So when we talk about the relationship between these variables, we also have to view it through that lens. And then that sort of immediately also narrows the way we interpret and the sort of extrapolations we can make from it. And then also in this paper, so we basically said that, okay, autonomy, let's have a look at if autonomy predicts your emotions in the classroom. And let's have a look if autonomy and the emotions predict academic achievement and willingness to communicate. And then let's see if there are not indirect effects that are possibly created by your emotions. So even if your own autonomy has a positive influence on achievement and on willingness to communicate, how does your emotions come into play and sort of might mess up this positivity? That's what we talk about when we talk about the nomological network. But of course, at the same time, when we say we drew arrows from learner autonomy predicting anxiety, predicting willingness to communicate, for example. At the same time, you can say, are there not feedback loops? Does it not come back again? My own decision yesterday to not speak Luxembourgish might have increased my anxiety in speaking the language, which made me perhaps feel less autonomous when it comes to speaking this language. So even though if we drew arrows in one direction in this paper, we are not arguing that the arrows can't come back. And that's sort of what we also mean with the tangled web or the nomological network, is this is sort of a mess of variables, all interconnected, all constantly influencing one another. And to try to untangle them means looking at little snapshots of research and little snapshots of the learning process. And of course, that doesn't tell the full story, but it does give us some interesting results, because in this case, for example, we did find that even though your autonomy is positively related to achievement and to willingness to communicate, so the more autonomous a learner feels, the more likely they are to achieve in their English classes, and the more likely they are to actually speak English. But if anxiety comes into play, it is a negative mediator. So anxiety sort of comes to reign on this parade of positivity, and suddenly you don't have the actual positive outcomes to the same strength that you would have if anxiety did not come into play. Which also, again, highlights that we kind of need to address learner anxiety to some extent, but it's really is quite hard. And it was the same for enjoyment, where we did find the mediating effect between autonomy and achievement by enjoyment. So if you are happy with the class, you are enjoying the class, it's meeting your psychological needs, then that joy boosts the positive effect of autonomy on achievement. So it does show that please be nice to your learners and, you know, create a good atmosphere in the class, which fully we can do. There are a lot of interventions and things on positive emotions that we can do, but a gap would be on negative emotions. Sorry if that explanation took forever, but yeah.
No, it's really, really interesting. But I just wanted to take it back so that the listeners can get a picture of what it was that you did. And in this particular study, which, you know, we're talking about it now, it was focusing on online learners in a particular time and place, which we all lived through, which was COVID. Right. So I know who it would be. Either one of you, maybe could you talk us through like the specific kind of online learning that these learners were doing, and yeah, what was going on with the learning that they were doing? What kind of online language learning were they doing?
So basically, I mean, we were lucky because this study that I talked about before was where Jean-Marc Dewali and I looked at learner emotions in online versus in-person classes. That happened right at the beginning of the pandemic. So this is when this whole series of studies actually started. And actually, together with an MA student at the University of Vienna, she then mirrored our original study, which the two of us conducted at the tertiary level, at the secondary level, in the school she just started working in, which is a vocational school in Austria with approximately 1,000 learners. And then we were able to basically come back and follow these learners throughout time. And this specific paper was based on a data set where we collected data towards the end of the pandemic. I think I can't remember, we had so many lockdowns, but I think it was lockdown 3 or 4. So it was a time where actually online language learning had become pretty normal for the students.
Okay.
Yeah, it was no longer this, it happening out of the blue, and then from one day to the next, it being a completely different setting. So they were really used to it. And back then, it was before Christmas when Austria decided, also because of Christmas and the numbers increasing again, okay, we're going to have another lockdown to make sure it doesn't explode over Christmas. And then we knew if we wanted to take the chance to find out more about, the online mode as it became more, as the learners became more comfortable with this setting as well, we had to be quick. And this data collection was quite intense because it was basically this former MA student of mine still helping me with the data collection. But it was the two of us who spent time with the students in 29 EFL online lessons taught via Teams as well, and collecting the data in 1 week.
Wow. Okay. So I wonder, do they have any, specific motivational profiles perhaps? And then, that's, part of it is they were on their 3rd lockdown or whatever. They'd got somewhat habituated to being there. It was the pandemic. It was a very particular situation. The fact that they're in a vocational school, does that determine what kind of language education they were receiving?
Yeah, I mean, they obviously don't have such a strong focus on languages. And I think what probably should also be added in this, and in vocational schools in general, for instance, what is also quite common in Austria is clear lessons and so content and language integrated input they receive, so where other subjects are taught through the foreign language. And what I think is also noteworthy for the people listening to the podcast here is because I think usually when it comes to studies into foreign language learning and also emotions, we often have a vast majority of female learners in our sample. And here it was the opposite. I think we had in total 490 foreign language learners and about 400 were male. So that is probably also something that I would like to add here.
Yeah, something to keep in mind as well.
Elouise, is there anything you want to add on that point?
I mean, as an aside, because that's also, I just think it's something that's quite important when interpreting the results of our study, is this sort of unique profile of the learners, is the fact that it is predominantly male, and we always have predominantly female in the vast majority of studies. It is a vocational school, so it is not necessarily, it's not learners who want to go and study languages at university, for example. It's not necessarily those type of learners. So it is a learner who is, for example, perhaps rather learning English for a more practical reason, that they want to go and do something practical and they want to be able to also understand maybe English guides on what they want to do, etc. So it's a more, I would say, a more practically driven motivation probably than a pure interest in language learning. And that might also tap into the way we measured things. So Yeah, I mean, in the paper, I think we also said that there definitely needs to be further research and replication examining this relationship between autonomy and these individual differences variables with a more broad sample. Because it is likely if you use, for example, the English students at the University of Vienna studying English, it's going to be completely different because these students are fully motivated to study English. They want to be there. They fully chose this, where if you are having English classes at a vocational school, it's not necessarily always a choice that you made.
Right, right. That's so important to understand the broader context in which these things are taking place, because it helps people to interpret what
Yes.
you found. And specifically on the actual education, the lessons, what were they doing? Were they taking Zoom classes? Was this do some worksheets on the Blackboard, on Moodle, or whatever it is? Like what was the specifics of what they were doing? How were they engaging in the learning?
They were they had the classes via Teams, so it was fully online, and it was as interactive as it could be. Yeah. So, using now I'm using Zoom terminology because I tend to use Zoom, but breakout rooms, is that what it's called in Teams as well? Yeah. And, giving presentations, etc. And like I said, I think what is important to understand about the point of data collection too is that the teachers already knew how to use these tools. So compared to our previous study where it just happened from one day to the next, and the teachers were still very inexperienced and trying out things like everyone going online, and if you're kicked out, then please come back in because I don't know how to it says breakout room, but let's that kind of thing. So yeah, this is how you could imagine it. So basically a teacher who already knows how to use these tools. And of course, I think what we also know from our own experience is it's different. Yeah, and it was different at the time from a regular in-person class when it comes to how interactive it can be. For instance, what our studies also showed is that the learners found it quite difficult when it comes to turn taking, which I myself, for instance, even now notice today when it's the three of us talking, because it's really difficult. When do I step in? When can I grab the floor? Or and of course, in that sense, these lessons were definitely different from what they were used to. But I'd say you can imagine them as having been, can I say, more kind of regular online classes that were prepared, etc., and everyone knew what they were doing, rather than it being the ERT mode at the beginning of the pandemic.
I see. So it kind of shifted mode into being the new normal there at this point. So let's talk about the data. What did you do? What kind of data did you collect, and how did you collect it from these guys? Maybe Elouise or Pia or whoever wants to take that question.
Pia was there for the data collection, so she's better in answering this.
Okay.
So basically, organizing the data collection was quite a big job during 1 week. And like I said, I was lucky enough that a former student of mine who then at the time was an EFL teacher in this school was still very much interested in following the learners throughout time. And then, we had the possibility to do that. And she organized it, and we used a web questionnaire where we measured the different variables that we spoke about. And what was also important was that because she was already there as well and was experienced with, data collection with secondary level students with a web survey. And it was important, that there was always someone that was either me or her all the time in case they had questions. Because, for instance, what I found out is we also need, data on the demographics and on the language learner history, and those questions linked to the language learner history are especially tricky, or were especially tricky for them. What counts, let's say, what counts as an L1? What is an L2 or LX? What does this mean? Yeah, so it needs to be someone who is able to explain these things, and and to also make sure that you explain them in the same way so that everybody understands them the way you want them to understand them. Yeah.
Right. And to be doing that at a step removed when everything is being done remotely seems incredibly challenging to have done, for sure. And
we also, just what came to my mind now is we also basically decided to, even though, the level of language competence should have sufficed, we also talked to the teachers in advance. Would they be able to do this in English, right? And they said, to be on the safe side, let's do it in German. And so we used forward-backward translation to make sure that they also felt more comfortable, because we also included open-ended questions, which are not part of this specific paper. We'd still need to analyze that, but then they felt more comfortable, really. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna ask, because there was a lot of scale-based data in the study, and it sounds like you did lots of other work around this. Was there any performance-based assessment or kind of observation by the instructors or by you guys of what the students were actually doing in their class?
What should be emphasized is that it is a cross-sectional study. And by that we mean is that we measure all of the variables as trait-like, situation-specific trait-like variables. So we are not observing a classroom to see who is acting autonomously, who did their homework, who engaged with, study hours or things like that. It is asking questions to students about their average behaviors in the online classroom. So how do they normally act? And that is also the way that this should be interpreted. And in terms of the cross-sectional as well, obviously it's not a longitudinal design. So we cannot use causal language. We can say that it might be more likely. We can say that, okay, you would need to investigate this and this relationship, and there seems to be a positive tendency or a negative tendency. But we cannot say that, okay, autonomy did cause willingness to communicate to increase. That we cannot say. We can say that there is a tendency, that the data did show a positive relationship, but this relationship was obviously cross-sectional. And in order to make actual causal inferences, we would need to have longitudinal data, even perhaps intervention-based data rather. So that's just, important to note. But Pia, I don't know if you want to add any additional stuff on the data set that we didn't include in the paper.
No, I mean, in the open-ended questions, as far as I remember now, we asked them about, telling us what they particularly enjoyed in an episode they particularly enjoyed in the online mode, and the same goes for anxiety. But to be honest, we haven't analyzed that yet. And just as you said, Elouise, I mean, what we need to be aware of about this study too is, and I think, Thomas, that in your podcast with Sarah Mercer, she also mentioned that a bit, that, when it comes to quantitative study designs, we tend to, can I say, fragment things a bit, and that would need to be this, qualitative add-on to be able to understand the complexities in a more nuanced way, I'd say.
Yes.
So this is what would be very much needed still, because what we can say and see is, how those variables are linked, but we obviously, based on that, we wouldn't be able to say what it is, for instance, that they enjoyed, or what it is that made them anxious, just solely based on this.
Right.
Data.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so now we've established a lot of context about exactly what was done, about this specific group, and So maybe we can circle back now to what it was that you found, right? So what were the important things that you found linking autonomy and emotion and willingness to communicate in this online environment?
Okay, so basically our foundational findings, I would say, is that learner autonomy, in the way that we measured it, obviously, was positively linked to both academic achievement in the English class and to willingness to communicate in English. So it shows that if you have a level of autonomy over your English studies, because obviously we measured it through study habits and learning environment, then you would be more likely to have a higher achievement, so a higher grade in your English class, and you would be more likely to be willing to speak in English. And then when we included anxiety and enjoyment in this relationship as well, we had a look to see that, okay, autonomy was positively related to enjoyment and negatively related to anxiety. And then from anxiety and enjoyment, anxiety was negatively related to both achievement and willingness to communicate, and enjoyment was positively related to academic achievement, but not to willingness to communicate, which was a bit of a surprising finding. So those were the direct paths that we tested. And then we also examined mediation effects to see if enjoyment and anxiety mediated the relationships between autonomy as the predictor and academic achievement and willingness to communicate as the outcome variables. And we did find that anxiety was a negative mediator for both relationships that we tested. So it negatively mediates the relationship between learner autonomy and academic achievement, and learner autonomy and willingness to communicate. So that is the thing of, even if there is a positive relationship between learner autonomy and willingness to communicate, if you have a level of anxiety, you're not going to reap the benefits necessarily of this positive relationship, because your anxiety is going to come into play and bring everything down. And it was the same with enjoyment. It seems to boost the positive relationship. But of course, we couldn't test a mediating effect with enjoyment as a mediator between autonomy and willingness to communicate, because the direct effect was not there. And that's a limitation of mediation. So we can't make that assumption. So yeah, that's the findings in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I think that finding, that that foreign language enjoyment was not linked to willingness to communicate in the online mode, to me was really, really interesting, because it kind of, it contradicted the findings. For instance, it was your meta-analysis, right, Elouise, where on enjoyment and willingness to communicate, where you actually found that it was it a moderate correlation? But
it was a moderate to large effect. Yeah, it was quite large.
So it was not weak. So it was quite surprising that they were actually not linked in the online mode, and that actually set us thinking a lot about why this is the case. And it might be that simply because emotions tend to apparently function differently, those learner emotions in the online mode, that might be the cause. It might also be the case that if you think about the online mode, that if when it comes to willingness to communicate, that those learners who are not, that it's easier for them to hide, rather than in an in-person setting. So it could be all sorts of causes, really.
Right, so some of the specific features of that online style of learning in particular. So to draw that out to a kind of implication, what would you Pia, you said you work with student teachers, right? So if you were to tell them, they've got an online class of learners, they've got to do whatever to reduce the anxiety, right? It sounds like it's such an important variable, actually, online or in the actual classroom as well, on site. What should they do? What would be the 1 point advice that you would give them?
Well, I would definitely, I think, based on this study, one important finding is to really, for student teachers to become aware of the importance of learner autonomy and to support their students in becoming autonomous learners, because nobody is born an autonomous learner. Yeah, they need to be taught, the strategies, how to plan their learning, how to monitor it, etc. And that this is really crucial for all these reasons that Elouise already mentioned. Yeah, because of the links that we also established. So I'd say that is definitely something. And of course, I mean, the emotions I tend to stress repeatedly, right, in my classes, to make my students aware of, the crucial role that they play in foreign language learning.
Right. Elouise, is there anything you want to add on that point?
I mean, yes, and I would also say, obviously, of course, all of this is sort of interconnected. So it's difficult. I mean, it would be difficult to even disentangle it to just give direct advice always, because accompanying your learner autonomy, the way you teach the students to actually, boost that, would also be linked to, okay, how do we give corrective feedback, for example? How do we talk to our students about when they make a grammar mistake or not? And that is directly linked to anxiety. And it's difficult because everything that you do in terms of individual differences are sort of interconnected. So the moment we try to address one variable, it is very likely that we're going to address a whole host of variables. So even in the advice of, yes, let's boost autonomy, it might be that we are also affecting the emotions. It might be that we are also affecting engagement, for example. So it's difficult to sometimes in these papers disentangle the exact implications for just this study because it goes so broadly. And that is, again, to come back to what Pia said, where you have to sort of, for quantitative research, we do take a snapshot. We do, my old psychometrics professor always talked about ring fencing. We ring fence some variables because it's not physically capable, like it's not possible to measure everything that might have an effect, because then we would have people sit there and fill out questionnaires for days at a time. So we have to ring fence and start looking at it. But then when it comes to the implications, it gets quite hard to ring fence the implications and to stay within our lane in terms of what we can say as quantitative researchers, and especially in terms of this paper, what we can say in terms of cross-sectional findings. So there are a lot of implications we can make, but I try to err a little bit on the side of caution of how far we can stretch it, and rather mention that a lot more research is needed in terms of learner autonomy, especially research in this way using questionnaires, and especially in terms of online learning, because there will be things like cultural expectations and the cultures of classrooms and the way that different people learn, etc. All of that will play a role. And in this case, where we had mainly a male class versus what does it look like if it's mainly female classes? What does it look like if it's gender balanced classes? And then, of course, what does it look like if it's younger learners, if it's older learners, if it's independent learners who are going back to university, etc. All of that will have an influence. So I would be very careful also to say how far we can stretch the implications of this study interpreting autonomy. I would say autonomy is important, but I would not go and say, oh, okay, autonomy is the key link to boosting our students' willingness to communicate, and that's what we should be focusing on at all times, because it's very likely that there's a whole host of other things that we indirectly accidentally measured.
Right. Okay, that's a really important message.
I just wanted to say I fully agree. But what I basically meant before is that I find it important to just raise the awareness of its role, because I think often they, from my experience, they were not necessarily aware of the role it plays in the online mode. Yeah. And just linked to what you mentioned with how we measure things and build models, etc. I think what is also a nice example is in this study is willingness to communicate, which is included as an outcome variable. But naturally, I mean, willingness to communicate is also basically an important driver right, of developing language proficiency. You have to use the language and communicate in it in order to improve, but at the same time, obviously, it's an important outcome. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I've taken a lot of your time. I want to go too much deeper into this because you've already talked a lot about it. But is there anything else you guys wanted to add on this topic? On this paper?
I mean, not really. Maybe go check out the special issue. It's very interesting papers that all link to Peter McIntyre's work. I mean, he's such an influential person in the field and also such a nice guy in real life. So I would advertise the special issue that was in his honor.
Nice.
And yeah, check it out. I mean, it goes far beyond autonomy. It's a whole host of individual differences research, but I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah,
Yep.
and nothing to add from my side other than thank you for inviting us. And I really enjoyed it.
All right. Pia and Elouise, thank you. So just one more time, the paper is A Tangled Web, Learner Autonomy as a Predictor of Learner Emotions, Willingness to Communicate, and Academic Achievement in Online Language Learning, which was in Language Teaching Research Quarterly, which is definitely, it sounds like a special issue that's very, very worth checking out. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. But yeah, Pia and Elouise, thank you for talking to me today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas.